It has been said that sacred geometry is the language of the universe, the building blocks with which the infinite intelligence constructs everything in creation, from the micro to the macro. Crystals as perfected geometric forms are a prime example of the underlying blueprint of balance, symmetry, and order. Does the geometry, the structure and shape of a crystal give us clues in terms of what its metaphysical properties are? Can the ways in which crystals are formed by the earth tell us what they are best used for? Is there, for example, a best shape for processing grief, or attracting love, or manifesting abundance? And is there an ultimate, perfect form to optimize a crystal's energetic functions?
Scientists believe today that Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. The first crystals began to form only 100 million years after Earth is believed to have originated at 4.4 billion years. So we know that because the oldest crystal that's been found now is a zircon crystal in Australia. And it is believed to have formed only 100 million years after the beginning of the planet that we live on. When we talk about these crystals and the immense age, there are so many different ways that they can form, and there are many different classifications. There are 32 crystal classes that are acknowledged in the scientific literature, and those classes are made from crystal systems, and there are 7.
These 7 are based on the actual lattice types of structures. So the lattice structure is the specific geometry that the atoms or molecules will arrange themselves around. And this type of geometry then determines the family or the sort of group of crystal types. For example, one of them is called triclinic, such as kyanite and turquoise. There's one that's called monoclinic. So for example, malachite and moonstone are monoclinic crystals. Another is orthorhombic, such as topaz and sulfur. There's rhombohedral, or sometimes rhombohedral is also called trigonal. So like calcite and ruby and sapphire are rhombohedral. And the hexagonal crystals are, for example, quartz, all the quartz crystals, and emerald is another example of a hexagonal. And sometimes they even form with 6 sides because of that hexagonal lattice structure. And then the final one is cubic, or sometimes they call it isometric. So for example, pyrite is cubic, and diamond is a particular type of cubic.
So each of these 7 crystal classes has many subclasses that are used, and it becomes very complex in terms of how the crystals are defined, the number of faces, the number of angles, the symmetry, the internal symmetry within the crystals themselves, all following very precise laws from a field of energy that we cannot see.
What's interesting about these forms is that they correspond to the elements. Now, the cube, which is the first of those forms, represents the earth. The octahedron, that represents the wind. The icosahedron, that represents the water. We have the tetrahedron, that represents fire. And we have the dodecahedron, that represents sacred sound. By visualizing these forms and encoding information and intention into them, we can create specific effects and amplify specific intentions. This demonstrates very clearly how the geometrically organized structure of the crystals is what is holding information, and that it's the information that we send forth that produces the healing.
And then we want to talk about the actual energy of crystals. We have to have a little context. It's helpful to know what energy really is. If we ask a room full of spiritual people, metaphysicians, and healers what the word energy means, we probably get a lot of nebulous answers. But the truth is that if we turn to physics to define energy, it's simply regarded as the capacity to do work. It is a quality that we can measure or quantify, and we can transfer it to some sort of object or system to perform that work or achieve that outcome. So all matter is functionally composed of these tiny little units. And the farther we subdivide them, the less they resemble matter and the more they resemble energy. They have this quality that can be transferred. They are, brimming with movement and motion, and they don't always behave like solid things. These not so solid things, when they come together, also generate these kind of standing fields of energy. So systems that vibrate generate electromagnetic fields. These fields expand infinitely from their point of origin at the speed of light, because technically light is one kind of electromagnetism, and other kinds of electromagnetism are therefore going to behave in very similar ways. So all this goes on to say that most of the world around us, most of the cosmos is just empty space. Even the things that appear really solid, like a rock, a mineral, a gem, a book, a table, are really made out of tiny little bits moving through that empty space. And we are interacting with their energy fields all the time. Sphere around it feels. One of the important things to know about this is that coherent structures are going to produce coherent fields, because all of these energy fields are reflections of what those items, those objects, those systems are made out of. So crystals, being by definition coherent, solid structures, are going to have these really coherent or organized energy fields. And while we're talking about energy, I also want to give us just a couple more terms that are really useful. I'm going to talk about frequency and amplitude in particular. We'll cover wavelength as a kind of tangent to this. So on the screen, when you see that little S-shaped curve, we call that a sine curve or sine wave. And that is one way that we map out the movement and relationship of energies. So frequency is denoted by A on the graph, and it is a measurement of the number of times that sine wave repeats. How many little squiggles are in that S given whatever our unit of measurement is? Usually we use things like the measurement hertz, which is the number of cycles per second. We measure brainwaves in hertz. We can measure sound in hertz and megahertz. But essentially, think of frequency like the station on a radio. And in fact, if we go back to the kind of ancient and mystical era when radios really did have knobs that you could turn the dial on, that number that you arrive at, that number that the station broadcasts at, is a reflection of the number of thousands of cycles per second, and it's the actual megahertz of the station. So frequency is the channel. Amplitude, on the other hand, is how far away that sine wave moves from the center. So it's the tallness, essentially, of that wave, and it represents the volume, the loudness of it. So it's how far from the midline that sine wave is going to rise and fall, because in theory they're supposed to be symmetrical. Now, wavelength is just going to be the distance between two equal points, two troughs, 2 points, 2 midsections, just so long as they're equivalent. And you're going to see that frequency and wavelength are going to have an inverse relationship. As the frequency increases, the wavelength is going to decrease. So we're not going to worry too much about what the wavelength is for the sake of this conversation. But it's really important to kind of bring us back to a tangible real-world analogy. Let's go back to that radio. The station is our frequency, the volume is the amplitude. And if we want to have the best listening experience, we have to make sure that we adjust both. So often in healing spaces, metaphysical spaces, spiritual spaces, we talk a lot about frequency and we neglect amplitude. And it doesn't matter what station you set your radio to if you haven't turned up the volume enough to hear it. And an important thing about crystal energy is that coherent structures, and therefore coherent energy fields, have a naturally higher amplitude than those systems that are less coherent.